Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the extra mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 288 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. We're really glad to have you with us. We are now, as this episode is releasing, we're now in the 30-day window leading up to the February 2020 exam. So obviously, for people taking that test, this is crunch time, and I know lots of you are working really, really hard, and we're excited to see all of the great results from our students that they're getting as they practice and narrow down their studies. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to go a little bit more theoretical to talk about something that I've been working on for some time. It's really the coalescence, I think, of two separate trends or strands of thought, the human potential movement and the test-taking structure and preparation. It's my contention, as I'm going to talk about in today's episode, that there is an overlap. There's a place where human potential and test-taking really meet up, and that's the place where Celebration Bar Review has been for some time now. And I'm going to try and show you in a brief discussion what that means in practical terms, in the way that traditional bar prep works and the way modern test prep works, and why modern test prep is so much more effective. And I'm really excited about this. I hope that you'll take a listen, or even better, watch. I use some visual aids, so if you're able to watch this podcast, that's great. And to do that, all you have to do is go to celebrationbarreview.com/288, and you'll be able to watch the entire video. Now, if you are listening, I'll try and describe in the discussion what I'm talking about, and you can certainly listen and subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, on radio.com, and just about any place that podcasts are syndicated. And if you're listening, make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss out on any episode. We come to you each week about this same time. Now, as we turned the corner into 2020, we began a new feature on the podcast, and that was a student shout-out, a discussion of something that a student had written or said to us that didn't necessarily make it into an interview. And I have a really wonderful email that I received from a student who goes by the name of Juris Tenor. And you'll understand why that name comes up here in just a minute. But this is a student who wrote to us about their experience using PhotoReading and Paraliminals. And I want to share it with you before we jump into today's discussion. I think it's a good prelude to what I'm talking about. But Juris Tenor wrote to us and said, the Paraliminals that I've been using in the CBR course place me in a mental relaxation, confident state to take full and complete advantage of photo reading and all of the great and effective things that Celebration Bar Review offers in its course layout. I started to use Paraliminals recently, and I feel like a totally different person at many levels, particularly in terms of anxiety, relaxation, and mental steadiness levels. And for me, that includes concentration, focus, and cognitive retention without additional effort. What's blown my mind, Juris Tenor says, has been the dramatic change in performance within the practical and practice multiple choice MBE questions and the degree of comprehension of the answer explanation. And essentially from one moment to another, it happened almost instantly. I really can't believe it. I guess this is what they mean by tapping into your internal resources. Just a week before starting them, I was a wreck because I found that I was underperforming. And so now I can see the value. But Juris Tenor says, here's the bonus for me, and it's a very personal story, and this is amazing, so stick with me. Juris Tenor says, opera singing, okay, there we get it. Opera singing is one of my most cherished and important hobbies, so much so that I happen to have one of the best and foremost voice teachers of the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and probably the most demanding one as well. He's not too elated about my bar prep and law career endeavors because he insists that I can make as much in a month performing at the Met what I would make in a year as a lawyer. He's probably right. But this is how much I really want to be a lawyer and a member of the bar. Well, last Saturday, my voice teacher pulled one on me. He wanted to see how fast I could learn and perform a Verdian grand opera aria. For those of you that understand opera, that means a lot more than it does to me, but apparently that's a big deal and difficult. And he said, it's something I had not officially sung before, And my teacher handed me the score and told me, quote, "Imagine that you're being asked to sing this tonight because the casted performer and the understudy both took sick." Now, be as it may, prior to going to the studio that day, I had listened to the peak performance Paraliminal, which is part of the recommended listening in my bar review studies. And two things happened. First, I photo read the aria along with scene 1 of Act 1 of the entire opera. But as a photo reader, when I held the vocal score upside down and read from back to front, my voice teacher became very worried because he thought I was flipping out. Yeah, that would be understandable. But then I sang the entire aria off book. In other words, the book was closed after only a 10-minute photo read and subsequent rapid read. And my voice teacher started shaking his head with a stunned look on his face. And then I opened my voice to vocalize, and my voice came out with full strength, brilliance, full control over the entire register, and with an agility that astounded me. At which point my voice teacher asked me if I had warmed up before our session, and he was totally incredulous when I said, no, I hadn't. My voice teacher thinks I warmed up and I'd been vocalizing and singing throughout the week, neither of which was true. And Juris Tenor says, well, there it is for what it's worth. It's a perk of being a student in Celebration Bar Review. Now, we're not going to say that you can be a great opera singer because you take our bar review course, obviously, but we are saying you can pass the bar exam and you can make the next bar exam your last bar exam using these kinds of tools. And in today's message, I'm going to talk very specifically about what these tools do for you in the context of why the human potential movement changes everything about the way you study from traditional bar study methods. Now, all of this is sort of encapsulated, I think, in our free training webinar. And I want to tell you about that before we jump into the meat of today's message. We are offering a free 90-minute training webinar called Do Something Different. Make the next bar exam your last bar exam. And this is a look at the 4 steps that we use in this modern test prep methodology, along with student comments like Juris Tenor's in their own words, where you get an opportunity to hear what they did and why it worked for them as they prepared for the bar exam. The training is completely free, and it's certainly life-changing. And best of all, in my mind, is that it's available on demand. You can watch at any time that fits into your schedule. All you have to do is go to the show notes here on the podcast to register, or if you prefer, you can go to our website at celebrationbarreview.com/webinar for all the details. Then sign up, watch the webinar at your convenience, and if you have questions as you're watching, there'll be a place where you can send an email directly to me from the webinar with your questions, and I'll be glad to respond. And I think that you'll find that watching this and finding out what successful students are doing, particularly repeat bar takers, can be literally life transforming. And so I encourage you not to wait another day. Go ahead and jump in, watch this, and take advantage of this terrific resource. All right, I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. I'm excited to share with you these ideas about the human potential movement and traditional training versus modern training. We've titled this Modern Test Prep for the Bar Exam, and I think you're going to find it's really fascinating in terms of why you should be doing something different. So let's jump in. Today I want to talk to you about what will seem like a very theoretical subject, but I promise it's going to become very practical before we're done. The subject is putting together 2 very different fields of study, the human potential movement and the test design and test taking movements. Now, these 2 movements together have operated in essentially different spheres. And over the past 10 years or so, they've started to have an overlap. And the overlap is what we're going to talk about today. It's human potential and test taking. And it identifies what you would be doing differently as a test taker working from a human potential standpoint versus a traditional test taker in a traditional learning standpoint. Now, you're going to have to bear with me for a few minutes. I need to give you a little bit of background, and then I promise we'll get to the stuff, the meat, the good stuff, the stuff that will help you actually prepare for the bar exam. If you're watching this on video, you'll see that there are a whole bunch of red things coming out from behind my head. This is a pretty good example, I think, of the human potential movement as it's identified, that within our minds, within our brains, we have enormous potential to do all of these different things. If you're not familiar with the human potential movement, I would simply point out people like Oprah Winfrey or Tony Robbins, Jack Canfield, Lisa Nichols. Now, those are names you might be familiar with, but the human potential movement actually traces its roots much further back, all the way back to William James in the 1800s, and Aldous Huxley, people like Viktor Frankl and Abraham Maslow, and then into the more contemporary era with people like Werner Erhard and certainly folks that have been coming along over the years with things like The Secret and other kinds of self-help or motivational pieces. Now, unfortunately, the self-help motivation stuff has gotten in the way of some of the understanding of what the human potential movement was really all about. And then about 30 years ago, a man by the name of Paul Scheele started working with the human potential movement in developing products called PhotoReading and Paraliminals. And if you're a regular follower of our videos and our podcast series, you know that we work with Paul, and we have incorporated many of those tools within our bar review program. In fact, we have a program called PhotoReading for the bar exam. In any event, the human potential movement, as it began to grow, really began to talk about this idea of a better life, more abundance in areas like health or financial prosperity, or better relationships, better performance generally. But one of the areas that the human potential movement stayed away from typically was standardized test taking. I'm not quite sure what the reasons were. Maybe they didn't think it was worth their time and energy, or maybe they just simply conceded the field to the educators and the test writers and the test makers. But generally speaking, you don't hear people like Tony Robbins or Jack Canfield talk much about test taking. Now, Paul was one of the first people to actually begin to dip his toe into that water, but that wasn't his primary area of emphasis. When we started working with Paul for the bar review, in fact, at Celebration Bar Review, we were the first formalized test prep company to actually get involved in the human potential movement with the folks at Learning Strategies. And it's been a really terrific collaboration over these past 10 years or so. Essentially, what we did in working with Paul was to take his natural brilliance model, which I'm going to share with you in just a few minutes, and we expanded it into the field of test taking. All right, so that's one part of the world that was happening out there. It was the human potential world. Now, at the same time that human potential movement was growing and taking shape and finding its roots or legs, there was a whole nother field of work going on in academia around test making and test taking. The traditional forms of testing have obviously evolved over the years. If we go all the way back to Socrates, the Socratic method was really a method of teaching and learning in which the instructor engaged with the students in a back and forth dialogue, and that was the earliest form of test taking. Over the years, test taking evolved, or devolved, if you will, into something that was more of a rote memorization and recitation kind of technique. And in the early schools in the United States, certainly back in the early 1700s, early 1800s, we were still teaching in a very traditional, here's the material and now recite that back to us. However, even as late as the mid-1800s, there was still a fair amount of dialogue that was going on in the testing process. In fact, if you read the stories of Abe Lincoln and how he, quote, read for the bar, that's literally what he did. He read and then was questioned in a dialogue about what he knew, and that's how he became a member of the bar. And that was the tradition for many, many years in the US. But along with industrialization and greater growth came a need for more standardized testing. And as the standardized testing world began to grow, we began to see the rise of things like the SAT and the ACT and the LSAT and the GRE and the GMAT and so on. And these were all ways in which educators felt that they could measure in a statistically significant and equitable way the growth and abilities of their students. Well, of course, there were real deficits in that basic approach to test making, test writing, test taking. Often those tests ignored real skills that people had outside of the area of just reciting information. And it was becoming increasingly clear that the tests were not particularly good predictors of how someone would perform in the real world. Now, they were particularly good predictors of how someone would do at the next level of education, particularly when that level of education used the same form of testing. So in other words, it was a self-reinforcing model. If you were good at the SAT, then you got into a good school. You took tests that modeled the SAT in college, and then you took the LSAT, and you were good at that, and you got into law school, and law school modeled what the LSAT taught, and the system simply replicated itself over and over again. But just as the human potential movement began to develop and modify itself over time, the testing movement also started to change. A man by the name of Grant Wiggins was a strong proponent of something called authentic assessment. And his work began to inform a larger body of educators, the New Schools movement, and Howard Gardner in the multiple intelligences movement. And they began to work towards a model of testing that actually measured how people learned and what they did with that information in a context outside of the artificial constraints of a test room. And it was pretty exciting work. Now, I was very fortunate to be involved in that early phase of the testing assessment world through my work at Celebration School. It put me in touch with Howard Gardner at Project Zero and Grant Wiggins in his authentic assessment work and many others. We were part of Ted Sizer's New School programs, and we began to work with these different forms of testing and assessment. Well, I guess I'm the Forrest Gump of this entire story, because my work with Paul Scheele in one field and my work with Howard Gardner and Grant Wiggins in another put me in a unique position to start to think about testing as it related to the human potential movement. And as I began to work in those two fields, it became clearer and clearer to me that there was, in fact, an overlap between them. What I want to do, if you're watching, is to show you a quick Venn diagram of what began to happen in these two worlds. And if you're just listening, I'll try and describe it as we're going along. On the one hand, we had this entire area that I will just call human potential movement. And the human potential movement began to expand and grow. And people like Paul Scheele came along and I think expanded that view generally. While that work was going on, as I say, there was a second group working in a different area, and it was called authentic assessment. And it was a different testing world. Now, what became increasingly clear was that there was going to be an overlap between those two. There was a point in which the human potential movement and the authentic assessment movement could work together to form a better way of evaluating what people did and how they could prepare for it. And that new method we would describe as the human potential test-taking method, which is not very clever, but HPTT. Okay, so it's the human potential test-taking method. And really what we want to talk about today is this area in here, this nice area that we've got that overlaps all of these areas and gives us a little bit of the human potential movement and a little bit of the test-taking movement so that you can improve your scores when you're studying for the bar exam. So our goal is to show you how these areas combine together so that when you're studying for the bar exam, you're actually able to take advantage of what we know about human potential and take advantage of the way the testing is structured so that you get the best possible result. And that's, relatively speaking, a new field of study. And it's where Celebration Bar Review has spent most of our time really for the past decade, is in that middle area between those two sections. Now, as I said, when these two movements came together, for me, the catalyst was some of the work that Paul Scheele did that he called the natural brilliance model. He put that out in a book many years ago, but began to refine those ideas and continues to this day to refine the natural brilliance model. And I want to just share a little bit of that model with you to give you an idea or a context about where we're going. Essentially, the natural brilliance model operates on two axes. The first axis we would think of as this one down here is our present axis. It's a time. So we've got the present, and then we've got the future. And then we have the second axis that's working in terms of our present lack of resources, if you will, or lack of whatever is going on, and then to what I would think of as abundance up here at the top. Now, we could finish this out and actually create a 4-section grid by just moving from one direction in the other. So essentially, the natural brilliance model says that most of us, when we're trying to learn something new, begin down here in this lower left-hand quadrant. We have in the present some lack. There's something missing in our world. We're not knowledgeable enough about the bar exam, for example, and we've got to learn about what to do. We've got to get better at it. And so the goal is, over time, we want to move from our lacking or limitation state up here in the future to something that is abundant and successful and fulfilling. And so we create this upward arrow from the lower left quadrant to the upper right quadrant. And that model, that arrow, would be the natural brilliance model. We would move from our present state to a future state that's better than where we are. Unfortunately, in the natural brilliance model, we also have to recognize that in our present state, even though it may have limitations, there are also some things that are pretty good with where we are right now, some things we like, some things we're good at. If you're a bar taker, I know some law, I know some writing, I understand how to do IRAC, and so on. So we have this present sense, but we also know that if we move forward into the future, there is a possibility we'll lose some of what we've already got. In other words, we will move from the upper left quadrant down the opposite direction to the lower right. In the future, we will have less than we had today. This is the fear, and I've talked in other places about the three voices of fear. These are the voices that tell us that we're not good enough and we're in danger, and it's the voice of cynicism and the voice of judgment. And all of these things cause us to not want to move from our current level of abundance in whatever area it may be to a place where we might not have that in the future. Well, how do you reconcile those two problems? We want to go from our present lack to an abundant future, but we also don't want to give up what we've currently got. Well, as Paul began to develop his model of natural brilliance, he saw that there was a way around that. And essentially what he said was, you're going to create a circumstance in which you move around the center in something of an arrow system. We move from where we are, the things that we have that are good, we incorporate those, and we keep moving in a system that takes us towards the future, holding on to what we have without giving up what we've already got. And our goal is essentially to keep moving, to keep circulating through those quadrants so that we continue to move towards ultimately a future that's abundant. Now, all of that is very theoretical, and you're probably saying, well, what the heck does that have to do with taking the bar exam? All right, I'm going to get there. I just wanted to give you that background first. And by the way, we'll link to Paul's book, Natural Brilliance, and to some of the other information that I think would be helpful to you. So with this model in mind, here's what we've got. The goal of the human potential movement is very simply not to learn more or know more. It's actually to use your inner existing resources. It's to make full use of what's already there in your own mind, in your own brain, in your own potential. That's what's called the human potential movement. Now, the goal of testing at the same time was to measure how you use the resources that you have. And I want to be clear about this. The goal of real testing is not to measure how much you know, but how you use what you know. If you're looking for proof of that in the bar exam, I can tell you that the emergence of performance tests has been a big part and a very visible part of that movement from the theoretical world to the practical world. Can I use what I'm doing? I would also say the growth of essays as a question form rather than short answer or multiple choice also reflects this desire for an applicant to show how they reason through a problem, what they think about it, how they would resolve the problem. In fact, I think even if you look at the development of the multi-state bar exam, the multiple choice questions, you'll see that the questions that were written in the first iterations of the exam back in the 1970s tended to be much more specific about what is the specific rule. Here's 4 choices, which one of these choices most matches up with the rule? Today, the answer choices are much more subtle and much less about the actual recitation of the rule and the implication and application of the rule to the specific fact pattern in the problem. I think it's much more a question that's built on the idea of, can you design a question that will measure how an applicant would use what they understand about the law, much more than how much law do they actually know. All right. Now, Given those two paradigms in front of us of human potential and testing, it's my contention that today we are at an amazing spot where we can actually bring those two together and use them for you to have more success on the bar exam. If you think about how test prep has been done for the bar exam traditionally, or in really any form of traditional standardized test prep, here's the analogy I would suggest. Essentially, what the test prep companies and mentors would say is that you come to me with an empty bucket. You don't know anything, and my job is to fill up your bucket. I'm going to put all of the information that you need into that bucket, and we're going to continue to raise the level of material in that bucket until we finally reach a tipping point. In a Rube Goldberg style, I guess, we reach a certain level in the bucket, and suddenly then the bucket becomes too heavy and it tips over, and all of that material gushes out, and congratulations, you win, because theoretically that set point occurred when you got to the test that you were taking, and by just releasing all of that information that was in your bucket, in your brain, if you will, that was good enough, and you would be successful on the exam. That was the underlying assumption. And in fact, it's still the underlying assumption of probably 99% of the test makers or test prep companies that are out there today. Their job, as they see it, is to just give you information, keep giving it to you, give you so much that when you go to the test and it triggers you at the test, you simply tip over and dump all of that out, and they filled it all up. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's the right material in the right place for the right reason, it's just you've reached a tipping point. And so the view is, for you as a test taker, your job is to fill up the bucket. Just get as much stuff in your bucket as you can. And if you don't believe that's true, think back to the way you've studied for tests like the bar exam. Hasn't it been, how many hours did I spend studying? How many questions did I practice? How many rules did I memorize? How much material did I cram into my brain? That is precisely what's going on. All right, now I'm going to ask you to consider a different paradigm. In a non-traditional test prep method, the more modern method, what Celebration Bar Review has led the way in doing, we view this completely differently. We believe that you come to us with a pretty full bucket already, and that is based on the human potential movement. You already have all of this great potential, and all we want to do now is unlock that potential and let it flow out. We will put some information in, but we recognize that you already come for the bar with your information from law school or from your years of practice or from your life experience. You already know a lot of information. And so we're less concerned about giving you tons of new information, although we will give you everything you need to be prepared, but we're much more interested in giving you information that is segmented in a way that you can then use it on the exam when you need it. You let it flow out. In other words, the bucket's already filled, and we can spend most of our time trying to figure out how to pour it out where it's needed and to be much more precise with how you use it. It's not the presentation of more information, it's the better use of the information that you've already got and that you are acquiring. So this model says that our primary task as a test prep company is to help you use the material you've already got. It's to help you unlock the potential that you already have within you. It is not so much taking away from that upper left-hand quadrant where there are things you already know. It's in fact using that, putting it into the cycle so that we are working together to give you the information you need and make you more effective. And so what we're doing is taking the natural brilliance model and we're applying it to bar prep and test taking. And that's, as far as I know, we're probably one of the few, maybe the only company that's significantly moved into that territory. Now, when we take the human potential model of learning, I think it's got some very interesting points of differentiation from the traditional test prep model. And I want to share some of those with you now. So what you should see on the screen, if you're watching, is a comparison of traditional test prep methodology and modern test prep methodology, and I'll walk you through it if you're just listening. The traditional test prep, remember, is based on the concept that we're trying to fill up your bucket. There are three essential components to it. The first is to cram, the second is to memorize, and the third is to recite. Now, why do we talk about those particular concepts? Well, if you think about what traditional test prep is trying to get you to do, we've only got to get the bucket filled up for a short period of time, and then we know it's going to dump out. So the most effective and efficient way to do that is to cram the material. Spend 7 or 8 weeks in the bar, putting all of that material into your brain so that it will just simply explode out. Now, I want to compare that particular model to the modern test prep model. Instead of trying to cram information into your brain, what we're doing is exactly the opposite. What we're looking to do is to help you release the information that's in your mind, your whole mind, not just your conscious brain. And you do that by noticing what's going on around you, by noticing what's in the fact pattern. What are the elements or the problems presented in the fact pattern? What are we trying to get at? What principle of law? What is the problem that's being presented to us? As we notice that problem, we then release, through a process called spontaneous activation, the information that you already have. Now, this is information that you've acquired through your photo reading, through your lectures, through your prior question practice, through all the work that you've done, both in the bar review and prior to that time. And we want to release that. So instead of trying to cram everything in, we're actually trying to release, let everything out. Very different. Now, the second thing that happens in traditional test taking is that you are told to memorize. Why do you have to memorize? Well, you're trying to put all that information into the bucket, but sometimes the bucket's got some holes in it, doesn't it? And things leak out. And so you have to memorize to hold it in the conscious mind. Now, unfortunately, our conscious brain is a finite capacity. It's like a hard drive on a computer. My hard drive is always telling me on my computer it's running out of disk space. So I have to eliminate something to put something else in. That is very much the model for a lot of bar takers. They try to memorize, but as they memorize, they're pushing other material out. That is a very difficult process, takes a lot of hours, takes a lot of energy, and it's relatively unsatisfying. I have rarely heard anyone say to me, I love to memorize things. It's really not what most of us want to do. It's not our natural way of learning either, but it is the format that traditional test preparation takes. Now, compare that to modern test prep, which says you don't have to memorize because, remember, it's already all there. It's in your non-conscious brain, the 90% you're not using. And really what you have to do is, instead of memorizing, we want you to respond to what you see. When you are reading an essay question and you come across a particular discussion, you say, oh, that's the statute of frauds problem, or that's the rule against perpetuities problem, or that's a torts negligence problem. And as you begin to respond to it intuitively from the absolute abundance of your natural brain, you begin to have lots of information. Now compare that to what a traditional test taker is doing. They see that same problem and they say, oh, that's a negligence problem. Duty, breach, causation, proximate cause, which of those out, right? And they start to work through it. But the natural brilliance model says, oh, I already know what that is. That's a problem of duty. Let's just talk about that and show how that applies in this situation. In other words, we're going to apply what we know to the problem instead of showing what we know because we filled our bucket up. So while the traditional test taker is spending hundreds of hours memorizing, the modern test taker is actually learning how to respond to the stimuli of the question by seeing the patterns that exist in the problem. So that kind of problem leads to this kind of solution. Very, very different. All right, and then the third thing that happens that's quite different, in traditional test prep, the goal is always to recite. Just recite, recite, recite. I see something, now I'm going to recite whatever I learned, right? It's a little bit like walking in and someone says to you, how are you this morning? And they say, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. What are you doing? Well, I learned how to say my ABCs, and so I'm just going to give you my ABCs. Well, yeah, but that's not what I asked you. It's not responsive to what I want to know. Yes, but it's what I learned. That is very much what goes on in the bar exam when people show up and they get a question and they start reciting all of the nonsensical rules, most of which aren't in dispute in the problem. It would be a little bit like going into court and saying, Your Honor, I object to that piece of evidence, but before I object, let me tell you all the rules about relevance. Well, is that your objection, counselor? No, it's not, but I learned all those rules and I want to recite them to you. Silly, isn't it? You would never dream of doing it in real life. So in modern test prep, instead of reciting rules, what we're trying to do is something quite different. We want to have you reflect and then witness. And by reflecting and witness, what we mean is that we want you to really show the reader that you understand what's going on in the problem. Reflect on it, think about it, and then feedback to the reader what that means to you. So instead of reciting this sort of random information, you're actually dealing with what's in front of you. You witness what's happening and you say, here's what I think the response should be. Here's how I think this problem would be resolved. And you reflect on it. You're not in a panic. You're not frantic to get things done. Now, when you take all of those three items and you look at them together, what you've got is traditional test prep telling you to cram, memorize, and recite. And modern test prep telling you, instead of cramming, release and notice, instead of memorizing, respond, and instead of reciting, reflect and witness. And this is powerful information, because when you start to do this, you really begin to get a very different result, not only in the way you study, but in the way you take the test itself. Now, at this point, I think it would be fair to ask, why is it that traditional bar prep uses this particular approach of cram and recite and memorize? And what's the underlying assumption about it? And so I want to look at some of the underlying assumptions in order to help you understand why, if you have a different set of assumptions, you would have a different methodology and approach to study. So here's a brief chart, I think that shows some of that comparison. When we think about traditional bar prep, I would say that the first thing that undergirds really almost all of it is this idea of a lack. In other words, when we are thinking about this idea of how do we prepare, traditional bar review says you lack information. Remember our goal of filling up the bucket. So everything is done from a lack. You have a lack of information. You have a lack of skills. You have a lack of ability. And so what we're going to do is give you all of that. We're going to cram it into you, and then we're going to hope that it comes out at the right time. This idea of lack then also creates enormous tension and pressure, right? You show up for the course for 8 weeks. You're told that you don't know anything, and you're terrified into getting ready for the bar exam. And it all comes from a position of limitation or lack. By comparison, the approach of the modern approach is to say, oh no, you actually have abundance. You have a lot already there. The moment you walk into modern bar prep, we already recognize and honor what you already know. Look, you've been to law school. You graduated from law school, whether it's here in the US or in another country. Many of you practice law. Many of you continue to practice law, and you're taking a bar exam in somewhere else. Many of you practice law in another country before you came here. You have an abundance of skills and ability. The most common thing I hear from bar takers who've been in practice is, why do I have to take this exam? I already have proven that I know how to practice. I agree. You've got an abundance, and we want to build on the abundance rather than building on the lack. As soon as we focus on the lack, what you're missing, what isn't there, look what happens. You become anxious, you become fearful, you become afraid of what you don't know. And that voice of judgment, that voice of cynicism, that voice of fear become incredibly loud in your head, and it becomes a real battle with you, within you, to get any information at all or to be successful. So the underlying assumption of lack, I think, is one of the most devastatingly wrong things about a traditional approach, about the big box bar review. But I could apply it to virtually any kind of traditional test preparation theory. And this lacking idea versus abundance, I think, is one of the main distinctions in the two approaches. Now, based on that idea of a lack of information, traditional test prep goes to the second level. And it says what we have to do to solve the lack problem is that we need to slowly and methodically put all of that information into your bucket. So we're going to take you through hours and hours and hours of detailed, methodical reading. We're going to have you fill in the blanks in lectures. We're going to have you do hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of practice questions. We're going to build it in with literally all of this work. A traditional bar review would tell you that on average, you're going to be working something on the order of 500 hours to prepare for the bar exam. And many people will tell me that they put in far more than that 500 hours. That's a lot of time to spend. The result of that, the reason for that, though, is the assumption is you start with 0. We've got to put it all in, and we've got to put it in such a way, because we're cramming it in. It's almost like trying to pack one of those U-Haul trucks. You got too much stuff for your truck, and so you end up trying to make it all fit just exactly right. And that is a very difficult thing to do, right? It's got to go in very slowly and methodically, and everything's got to fit and be jammed around. Now, when you compare that slow and methodical structure to modern bar prep, the approach here is, instead of going slowly, we go fast. We go really fast. By using tools like PhotoReading, we can move your reading speed from the average of 110 words per minute up to as high as 25,000 words per minute. And here's the best part. At 110 words a minute, studies show that retention is somewhere on the range of 40 to 50% at tops. We'll move that number up to 75% or higher. Why? Because your non-conscious mind, your genius mind, is able to take in far more information than your conscious mind ever could, and retain it and hold it, and then give it to you when you need it. As a result, you can photo read a subject matter outline hundreds of times, because it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to read an outline that would traditionally have taken you 10 or 15 hours to read traditionally, and you'll have better retention and understanding of the material. As a result of that, instead of this methodical, we have to place everything just so, we can take the approach of a very wide approach. We can put all the information in and have you generate mind maps, visual representations of the material, so that instead of having to fit it all in, right, it's got to be exactly in the right spot, we can give it to you in a relational position. And you can say, oh, I see how this concept in constitutional law fits into some other concepts in constitutional law, instead of trying to wedge it into that little corner called the 14th Amendment. That is a fundamental difference in the way that you learn. And what it means is you learn much faster. So instead of the 500 hours that a traditional course talks about or more, we talk about 250 hours. And we've proven over and over again that that is absolutely manageable. Now, the practical implications of that are that if you've got a family, a full-time job, commitments outside of studying for the bar, which would you rather spend, 500 hours or 250 hours to get the same result? And here's the interesting part. The result of this slow and methodical approach is not more successful than the wide and fast approach that we use. In fact, given the same cohort of repeat bar takers, we are dramatically more effective than the big box bar reviews. So I would tell you that if you think going slower means you'll do better, that is a myth. Won't happen. And empirically, it's proven that it doesn't work that way. So something to keep in mind. Now, the third underlying assumption that I think is worth considering is this idea of zero sum. And what I mean by that is that in the traditional bar prep methodology, because we're working from this position of lack, this theory that we don't have enough, we also have to then assume that if I put new information in, at some point I'm pushing other information out. It's a zero-sum game. There's a finite capacity of what I can hold, remember, memorize, and recite. And I think you've all experienced that. And so what do the big box bar reviews do to try and counter that? Well, a couple of different things. They'll use mnemonics, right, which I can't spell, but you get the idea. They'll use flashcards. They'll use fill in the blanks. They'll use a variety of tools to help you get through this zero-sum game. I've only got so much space, so I'll use essentially an algorithm. In fact, there are some bar reviews that are nothing but algorithms, or at least claim to be algorithms, so that you can skip the things you don't have to know because it's a zero-sum game. And if you learn too much, what would happen? You'd have to push out some of the stuff that you already know to add the new material. You see how that works against you? Wait, you don't want me to learn more? Because if I learn more, it means I have to give up something I already learned? Does that make any sense? Is that how we learn in life? When you learn something new at work or in life, did someone say to you, now you're learning this, but that means you have to forget something else and never have it back again? What a crazy idea that is. It doesn't apply anywhere else except in areas like test preparation. And really, when you stop and think about it, it should make you go, oh, it doesn't make much sense to me. So that's the zero-sum assumption. But remember, our assumption in the modern era and in the modern world is exactly the opposite. It's unlimited. We can continue to put more information in because it's unlimited. Your non-conscious brain has the capacity to hold as much information as you want. And putting more in doesn't mean moving anything out. It means adding to what you know. You know more today than you knew a year ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago. That is the human experience. We learn more, we gain, we know more. It's mirrored in everything we do except traditional test taking. And in that traditional model, we say, oh no, this is new, you got to get rid of something. In our model, we say, oh, this is new, this is wonderful, add it to what I already know. Help me build and create more understanding, more knowledge, more wisdom, more application. I hope that makes sense to you. If it doesn't make sense to you, go take a traditional big box prep course and you'll understand after about 4 weeks so exactly what I'm saying. They keep driving down more information because they're terrified you don't have enough and they want to put more in, but they know when they put more in, something's got to go away. And so they're putting it in this really jammed, squeezed, tight methodology. That doesn't feel very good. On the other hand, if you come to a modern preparation course, we start with the assumption that you know a lot, you have an abundance, and we're going to add even more, and we're going to do it really quickly because there's plenty of room. We don't have to be really tight in how we put it in. We can put it in and figure out how it all fits together through relational visual mapping. And as we do that, it's unlimited. We can add as much as we want. I have students who tell me repeatedly that they have photo read their outlines hundreds of times. They have created many, many mind maps. They have all kinds of information. And when they get to the exam, what happens is they see the answers. They literally see them popping up, whether it's an essay or a multiple choice. Why does that happen? Is it magic? Of course not. All it is your brain responding to what it's seen. Remember, we talked about this idea of responding rather than memorizing, and then reflecting and witnessing instead of reciting. And so you get a more focused, better answer to an essay or a performance test or to a multiple choice test because you're no longer trying to do something that is unnatural and ineffective. All right, well, that's a lot to absorb, I realize. But I thought it was important to get an idea of how all of this works together so that you could move from this idea of the present lack into a future where you had an abundance. And if you start with the idea, if we begin, as we talked about in our 4-quadrant picture here, if we begin here that we've already got an abundance and we start to move from that point of abundance through the areas that we recognize we could gain and grow in. So maybe I'm not so good in property right now, but I can gain and grow and add that to my repertoire. I get better. I hold on to the things I already know how to do, and I don't have to worry about a future where I have less, but in fact, I have a future where I have much more. You see, what most traditional bar prep does, and most traditional testing has done for years, is to assume that all you have to do is fill up the bucket and then hope for the best. But you know, in this day and age of more sophisticated testing, more sophisticated measurement, it's just not necessary, and it's really not even well-liked or effective. So what I would encourage you to do as you get ready for your bar exam, regardless of whether it's just a few days away or it's months away or a year or two away, is to begin to think about the model of how you want to study and learn. Is it a model that's built on the assumptions of lack or of abundance? Is it built on a model that says that we've got to go slowly and methodically, or that we can go fast and we can make it wide? Is it built on a theory of zero sum, or is it built on the idea of an unlimited potential? The human potential movement's got a lot of interesting components to it, and sometimes it's been abused, to be sure. But I think that the underlying concept that you can begin with a huge advantage just because of what you already know and what you're capable of doing is something that we've ignored for far too long. And traditional test preparation has really ignored that to, I think, the detriment of the people taking the test. So I would encourage you to consider this idea, this new model of learning, and to find out how it might apply to you. I want to encourage you, if you've got questions, to reach out to me. There'll be a link here for you to set up a free conference and consultation with me, and you can find out more about what we do and how Celebration Bar Review has been at the forefront of this new era of human potential and test taking. And then I wish you an abundant future, one that is filled with great test results because you're actually able to show what you know and what you understand and not what you tried to cram in order to correct a deficit. Well, that's our message for today. I want to just reemphasize that if you've got questions or you'd like to know more about this particular approach, there is a place right here in the show notes where you can schedule a free conference with me to consult about your bar studies, I'd love to talk with you and help you understand the difference between our approach to bar prep and just about everybody else's. And I hope that this gave you some things to think about, but more importantly, some reasons to be really optimistic, particularly if you have taken the exam and not been successful in the past. I would suggest that that's probably more a result of the way you prepared than your own ability. And we can untap and unlock that ability and show you how to be successful on the exam. Now, again, if you'd like to know more about this approach, I want to invite you to our free training webinar. Do something different, make the next bar exam your last bar exam. You can register at celebrationbarreview.com/webinar or by clicking on the show notes at the registration page, and then you can watch at a time and date that's convenient for you. I hope everybody has a great study week as we get closer and closer to the exam. I know that feels like the pressure is beginning to bear down, but remember, you have abundance and amazing abilities, and all you got to do is untap them. You don't have to work from that position of a lack or not having enough. And by changing that paradigm, everything can change for you. And so we'll see you again next week here, same time, same place, along the extra mile. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.